The sun beats down on the courtyard. A 10-year-old girl plays with her dolls, oblivious to the horns echoing in the distance. These aren't just any horns. They herald the arrival of the Pontifex Maximus himself. His mission? To choose a Vestal Virgin. The highest honor, they say. But her mother already knows the truth. She collapses weeping as the priest's gaze locks on her daughter. "This one serves Vesta," he booms, sealing the girl's fate. 30 years of sacred terror, and punishments so brutal, death would be a mercy. But to understand how she ended up here, we need to go back. This wasn't an honor, it was a kidnapping, blessed by the gods. A Roman girl between 6 and 10, perfect in body and lineage. But what they didn't tell you was families hid their daughters when the Pontifex Maximus made his rounds. They knew what awaited those chosen. The girl is taken that very day, her name, her family, erased. She is now property of the goddess Vesta, the House of Vestals, a beautiful prison. Marble columns, ornate gardens, but every move is watched. She learns the 3 sacred laws: perpetual virginity, absolute obedience, constant guardianship of the sacred flame. Laws backed by punishments that made Roman crucifixions look humane. Her body now belongs to Rome, and Rome had very specific ideas about what happened to women who failed in their duties. She is told she's sacred, blessed, but this status makes her punishments all the more brutal. She is too holy to execute, too valuable to release. So, Rome perfected torture disguised as divine justice. New Vestals wept for months, begging to go home, but resistance was futile. You belong to us now, forever. The psychological conditioning was systematic. Her worth depends on her performance. Any mistake triggers punishments that would make her long for death. But death wasn't allowed. This sacred status was the foundation for cruelty studied by modern psychologists as institutionalized psychological warfare. Rome perfected the art of destroying a person's spirit while keeping their body alive to continue suffering. But what happens when a Vestal makes her first mistake? The sacred flame in the temple of Vesta, it must burn eternally. If it goes out, it's not just a religious failure, it's treason. The investigation begins immediately. The Pontifex Maximus interrogates each Vestal, searching for negligence, distraction, or moral corruption. The questioning lasts for days. The suspect, isolated in a windowless chamber, deprived of food and sleep until she confesses. But confession is just the beginning. The punishment is called the verberatio. It takes place in absolute darkness in the depths of the temple complex. The condemned Vestal is stripped naked and bound to a wooden frame. The Pontifex Maximus himself administers the beating using consecrated rods. The beating is not random. It is a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to inflict maximum pain while preserving the Vestal's sacred status. She cannot scream. A leather gag muffles her agony. She cannot bleed visibly. The rods cause internal bruising and organ damage without breaking the skin. Ancient medical texts describe Vestals who died days later from internal injuries sustained during verberatio. But the official cause of death was always listed as sudden illness or divine displeasure. The beatings were conducted in such secrecy that most Romans never knew they occurred. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical torture. She never knew when the next flame inspection would occur. She lived in constant terror that a draft might extinguish the fire, or that her attention might wander for just a moment. This chronic fear created severe anxiety disorders that manifested in physical symptoms. Historical records describe Vestals who developed tremors, lost their hair from stress, and aged decades in the span of months following their first verberatio. The trauma wasn't just physical. It was a systematic destruction of their sense of safety and self-worth that made them more compliant for future decades of service. But the most insidious aspect of this punishment was its randomness. The sacred flame could die from natural causes completely beyond any vessel's control. A sudden wind, a structural problem with the temple, or even sabotage by enemies could extinguish it. But responsibility always fell on the vessels, and punishment was always inevitable. Some historical accounts suggest that the flame was deliberately extinguished by authorities who wanted to punish particular vessels for political reasons or personal grudges. The religious pretext gave them perfect cover for what was essentially state-sanctioned torture of defenseless women. The recovery process was deliberately prolonged to maximize psychological impact. The injured Vestal would be tended by temple physicians who had been instructed to provide minimal care, ensuring that her recovery was slow and painful. She would be reminded daily that her suffering was deserved, that she had failed in her sacred duty, and that only perfect service going forward might prevent future punishment. This created a cycle of trauma and compliance that lasted for decades. Vestals who survived verberatio became completely subservient, terrified of showing any sign of independence or individuality that might trigger another round of punishment. They transformed from human beings into hollow shells that performed their duties with mechanical precision while their spirits slowly died inside. But if you think ritualized beatings were Rome's most creative form of cruelty, you haven't heard about their solution for Vest accused of the ultimate transgression. What was the ultimate transgression? The charge was called incestum, meaning pollution or defilement, and it referred to any suspected violation of a Vestal's vow of chastity. And the punishment for incestum wasn't execution. It was something far worse. The case of Opmia and Floronia in 216 BC provides the most detailed account of this horror. According to the historian Libby, both women were accused of breaking their vows of chastity based on nothing more than gossip and political rivalry. Their trial, if it can be called that, was conducted in complete secrecy by the College of Pontiffs. No defense was permitted. No evidence was required beyond accusations from anonymous sources. When the verdict was announced, the condemned Vestal was told she would be returned to the earth from which all life springs. This poetic language disguised a punishment so horrific that it defied human comprehension. The ritual began at dawn, with a procession through the Roman Forum. The condemned Vestal was dressed in a white bridal gown, her hair arranged in the style of a new bride, flowers woven into her veil. To observers who didn't know the truth, she might have looked like she was going to her wedding. In a sense, she was. She was being married to death. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Rome, allowing citizens to witness what happened to women who defied sacred law. But the Vestal wasn't allowed to speak, to cry, or to show any emotion. Her mouth was sealed with wax to prevent any final words that might create sympathy among the crowd. The destination was the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of the Wicked, located just outside the city walls. There, workers had spent days preparing her final resting place. A chamber had been carved into the earth, accessed by a narrow staircase that would be sealed forever once she descended. Inside the underground chamber, Rome demonstrated its twisted sense of mercy. A bed was provided along with a small lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a cup of milk. The official justification was that Rome wasn't executing the Vestal. They were simply placing her in isolation and allowing the gods to determine her fate. The food and water proved they weren't committing murder. This was legal fiction at its most cruel. The provisions were calculated to last exactly long enough to maximize her suffering. The lamp had oil for perhaps 6 hours. The food and water might sustain her for 2 or 3 days, but the air in the sealed chamber would run out long before the food did. The descent into the chamber was choreographed to maximize psychological torture. The vessel had to walk down the stairs herself. She couldn't be carried or forced because that would make Rome responsible for her death. She had to participate in her own burial, making the final choice to enter the chamber that would become her tomb. Once she reached the bottom, the staircase was quickly dismantled. Workers filled in the opening with earth and stones, packing it so tightly that no sound could escape. The surface was smoothed and marked only with a small stone that bore no inscription. Within hours, no visible trace remained of what had occurred there. Ancient sources describe what happened next in clinical detail that makes the horror even more unbearable. The condemned Vestal would have several hours of lamplight to contemplate her situation. She could see the food and water, could calculate exactly how long her torment would last. She could hear her own breathing getting harder as the oxygen slowly depleted. Some historical accounts mention scratching sounds heard from underground in the days following these burials. Workers reported strange noises coming from the earth near burial sites, sounds that might have been fingernails clawing at stone walls or wooden planks scraping against dirt as the victim tried desperately to escape. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the complete silence that followed. The victim's name was erased from all public records. Her family was forbidden to mourn her or even speak her name. She didn't just die. She was retroactively removed from existence as if she had never been born. This erasure was so complete that modern historians struggle to identify victims of living burial because their names were systematically removed from surviving documents. We know the practice occurred regularly over centuries, but the victims became nameless shadows lost to historical memory. The legal justification remained the same throughout Roman history, because the Vestal entered the chamber voluntarily, because food and water were provided, because no Roman citizen directly killed her. This wasn't considered execution. It was simply divine judgment expressed through natural consequences. After 30 years of service, surviving Vestals were theoretically free to leave temple life and reintegrate into Roman society. They received ceremonies honoring their decades of faithful service, financial rewards from the imperial treasury, and official permission to marry and start families. This sounds like a happy ending to a difficult life, but the reality was far more sinister. Consider the mathematics of this freedom. She was 38, 30 years serving the gods, and now, nothing. No husband, no family, just a small house outside Rome and the chilling certainty that she was more feared than pitied. Why? What had 3 decades of sacred service cost her? It wasn't just her youth or her fertility. It was something far more sinister that Rome had stolen. To understand how Claudia Quinta ended up shunned and alone, we need to go back 30 years, back to when she was just 8 years old. 8 years old and chosen. Chosen for a life of unimaginable privilege, but also unimaginable terror. She was to become a Vestal Virgin. From that moment, her life wasn't her own. She was property of the state, a living sacrifice to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Her primary duty? Keep the sacred flame burning. Let it die, and the consequences were unthinkable. But it wasn't just the flame. It was the constant scrutiny, the ever-present threat of punishment, the crushing isolation. Imagine a world where one mistake could cost you everything, where a dropped stitch in your robes, a moment of inattention during a ritual, could lead to a brutal beating. These weren't gentle corrections. These were ritualized floggings designed to break the spirit, to instill absolute obedience. The blows landed, again and again, each lash a reminder, you are nothing. The goddess is everything. And the horror was only beginning. The beatings were horrific, but they weren't the worst. The worst was the possibility that they might fail. The fear that you would fail so badly that you would be buried alive. Because the ultimate punishment for a Vestal Virgin was to be entombed. A small chamber beneath the city, some bread, water, oil lamp, and then the stones were laid. No escape, no sound. Just the slow, agonizing realization that you were being forgotten, suffocated. But to be clear, the living burial was rare. Most Vestals served their 30 years, and then, at 38, they were released. Free! Except they weren't. In an era when women married young and started families, a 38-year-old woman was considered past her prime, unmarriageable. The freedom to marry was meaningless when no one wanted you. But the social obstacles were even more brutal. Romans believed that a woman who had spent 3 decades in sacred service was fundamentally different, touched by divine forces in ways that made her unsuitable for ordinary human relationships. Men feared that marrying a former Vestal would bring divine retribution. Take Claudia Quinta. After completing her service, she was granted a substantial dowry and introduced to potential husbands. But each engagement was broken. Families consulted religious authorities who declared that marrying a former Vestal would pollute their bloodlines and anger the gods. Claudia spent her remaining 20 years living alone, shunned, never married, never had children. She died in complete isolation. Her funeral was attended by hired mourners, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. And the financial rewards often failed to materialize. Promised pensions were reduced or eliminated entirely during their decades of service. They emerged from temple life not just socially isolated, but economically desperate. No family support, no practical skills. The psychological damage from 3 decades of institutionalized trauma created additional barriers. Former Vestals frequently suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, panic attacks, paranoid episodes, difficulty forming normal human relationships. Some woke screaming from nightmares about the sacred flame going out. Some compulsively checked locks. Some couldn't bear to be touched. Their minds had been so thoroughly conditioned by fear and isolation that freedom felt more terrifying than captivity. Some attempted suicide. Others retreated into complete hermitage, recreating their temple isolation in private homes. A few tried desperately to reintegrate, but found themselves completely unprepared for basic social interactions. The most tragic cases involved former Vestals who developed what historians called sacred madness. They would wander through Rome claiming to receive visions from Vesta, preaching to crowds, performing bizarre rituals. Roman authorities ignored them, treating them as harmless lunatics rather than addressing the systematic trauma. Perhaps most cruelly, some former Vestals were recruited back into temple service as advisors or supervisors, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Having survived their own torture, they became complicit in inflicting the same suffering on younger women, creating an institutional memory that preserved these brutal practices for centuries. The promise of freedom was the cruelest deception. These women had sacrificed their youth, their fertility, their families, and their sanity for Rome. In return, they received social exile, economic abandonment, and psychological destruction that lasted until their deaths. The treatment of Vestal Virgins reveals the sophisticated cruelty that Rome could disguise as religious devotion. These women weren't just victims of individual sadists. They were casualties of a systematic program designed to control female autonomy through institutionalized terror. Modern psychological analysis suggests that the Vestal Virgin system was a centuries-long experiment in trauma-based social control. By taking girls at their most vulnerable age, isolating them from normal human development, and subjecting them to unpredictable punishment and reward cycles, Rome created a class of women who were completely dependent on institutional approval for survival. The ritual beatings destroyed their sense of physical safety. Living burial eliminated their hope for future freedom, and the false promise of eventual liberation crushed their spirits entirely. What makes this system particularly horrific is how completely it was normalized within Roman society. Citizens who would have been outraged by similar treatment of male slaves accepted the torture of Vestal Virgins as necessary. The religious justification made the cruelty invisible. The legacy of these practices extends far beyond ancient Rome. The systematic use of sexual purity as a tool for social control, the institutionalization of violence against women within religious frameworks, and the psychological manipulation of victims into accepting their own oppression can be found throughout history and continue in various forms today. These forgotten women deserve to be remembered, not as symbols of Roman piety, but as human beings who endured unimaginable suffering in service to an empire that valued their compliance more than their humanity. Their stories remind us that the most dangerous tyrannies are often those that wrap themselves in sacred justification and claim divine authority for human cruelty. Remember that these women lived, suffered, and died as real human beings, not as footnotes to imperial glory. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their individual courage, but our obligation to recognize and resist institutionalized cruelty wherever it appears. Just like those Vestal Virgins, walled up alive and then forgotten. Don't let history repeat itself.